Good morning, everybody. My name's Belinda Morris. I'm the editor of the Jeweller magazine. Welcome to our latest Meet the Creatives. I'm really glad that you could join us. I expect there'll be a few more people joining in as they hook onto Teams. I'm delighted to be introducing you to jewellery designer Theo Fennell. Should say globally renowned designer to the stars, Theo Fennell, who is going to talk us through his jewellery journey from the beginning, I hope, and show you some of his work. So if everybody could mute their mics, which will help reduce the feedback so we can all hear Theo. That's great. Anyway, thank you very much. Good morning, Theo.
Good morning. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got to where I am now.
Yes.
I went to art school up in New York. I did a foundation course and not really knowing what I was going to do. And I became that sort of person people discuss at breakfast when they say, what are we going to do with Theo after I left art school? Because I really hadn't done very much apart from but then I went and answered an advertisement that my great aunt Mary, who was a great influence in my life, found that said that an old established firm of silversmiths was looking for a young man of good aspect and gentle background with artistic leanings to work with older men, which I think nowadays you'd probably avoid like the plague. But I went along and found myself working for Edward Barnard's and Sons, who were the great silversmiths of the day. And I had a sort of epiphany after about 3 weeks. I went into the workshop and I saw people making silver as they were then, unbelievably skilled people making wonderful pieces. And they were also friendly with each other. They were also communal, as it were, in their ambitions and in what they were doing. I just loved the atmosphere. I loved the whole process of the sort of alchemic process of a bit of metal suddenly becoming a candlestick or whatever. But it was in Hatton Garden, so I started to look at the jewelry there a lot. And very stupidly, when I was too young to really know better, I started a little shop, which is this photograph here. And it was a shop in the Fulham Road, which in those days was a very provincial little road, nothing like it is now. And it had been a Victoria wine shop, so it had a basement that I made into the workshops and the studio, and we had a little shop, as you can see from this slide, on the ground floor. And I started off knowing nothing about anything, and I didn't have the money to work with diamonds and rubies and emeralds, so I started to use a lot of precious stones. And then if you go to the next slide, I started to make these rings, Bombay rings, very simple, but very well made by the boys that worked for me. And the workshop then, 3 of the boys that started with me then in 1982 are still with me now. So near on 40 years. They were exceptionally good, and they are exceptionally good. So they made these very simple things very well, and they sort of enjoyed a vogue. So I suddenly started to get a lot of people coming to the shop. We had no advertising, there was no internet, there was no social media, so it was really word of mouth. And I used to go to every party I could and hand out cards to people, and short of begging them on bended knee to come to the shop, I would do pretty much anything else, and they did start to come to the shop. And we were doing silver and jewelry, which was unusual in those days, and everything we did was 18 karat, which was also unusual. And the next slide, if we could have the next slide. I don't think I can do this. Yes, was the first big commission I got, which was the MCC Bicentenary Trophy, which I made for the Marylebone Cricket Club, which was then having the bicentenary test match at Lord's. And this had a big sort of introduction from Prince Philip, and it's now still in the museum at Lord's. And it was a sort of big moment for me because it gave a little bit of credibility to what I did. Next slide, if I may. And one of the things I started to do then with the jewelry was the cross and the key, which seem very obvious now, but this was, I guess, the early 80s. And I started to use things like the leaf image, which you see here, this little design. And so we started really, without knowing it, having what you call collections now, things that sort of hung together. And it started to get a little bit of momentum. And then, next slide, if I may, this gentleman came along. That's me on the right as a much younger person. And in front is Elton John, who came into the shop and started to buy from me. But more importantly, he commissioned me to make lots of things and just said, kind of make what you like. But he also introduced me to many of his friends, whether it be Gianni Versace or singers, Lulu, whatever. So a lot of people that he knew started to come to see me. And it was a really big break. I mean, nowadays it would be, I guess, the equivalent of some huge sort of person on social media taking you up. But it was a really big moment for me because he introduced a lot of people to me, and including people like the Beckhams and whatever. So it started to become a much more kind of serious enterprise than really when it had started. And we were still unbelievably naive as it were business-wise, but nonetheless, that had a huge impact. If I could have the next slide, please. And because we had a lot of rock and roll clients, a lot of music business clients, we started to make models like these. And, you know, one was for Mark Knopfler from the front of his album. And then we made things for Clapton and for Paul McCartney, etc., etc. So it became a sort of word of mouth thing, which was really extraordinary at the time because we couldn't afford to advertise or anything. But most of the stuff we were doing then, as now, became commission work, became bespoke work. And the next slide. And I started to work with the cross in many, many different ways. These are just three of them. And it was something that I'd always loved. I loved the iconography of it. And with the key, which was not so, didn't really have so much heft or meaning to it. And then later with the phi, which you'll see. But these crosses became really very popular. They were worn by a lot of people. And when people saw them, I remember Ozzy Osbourne coming into the shop to buy one, and he sounded like a sleigh bell coming in. He was shaking so much, and he had so many bits of jewelry around his neck that he sounded like a bell ringer. And I remember he paid by check, which is how people paid in those days. And he managed to roll a joint with one hand and sign a check with the other, which I always thought was an extraordinarily loose thing to be able to do. Next one, please. So this is the workshop as it is now. And I've always had a workshop. I believe absolutely implicitly that if you're going to design jewelry and you're going to have jewelry made, even though I don't sit at the bench anymore, you've got to have a team around you that understand you, that work with you, and who are on site, who are next to you. Otherwise, I've always sort of believed it's like a chef sending his recipe abroad or sending his recipe to wherever and having it made and bringing it back. I don't think the process is like that at all. I don't believe really in that thing of making hundreds of the same thing just the way I am as a jeweler. I like to make one-offs, same with silver, and I like to make the most small editions. So this workshop is where the magic happens. And on the right is Stefan, who has been with me now. He's a new boy. He's been with me for about 25 years. He's 75 now. He's a great, great jeweler. He started off working for Andrew Grima in the days in the 60s when Andrew Grima was such a great, great force. And he's still with me now, and he's still the most brilliant jeweler and trains some of the apprentices. And he's a wonderful, wonderful patient man. Next one, please. So we were able at that stage to start producing some more kind of outrageous pieces, but also to use stones like this blue-green tourmaline, which I think lots of people would now call a Paraíba, but I only believe that things that actually came from the Paraíba mine should be called that. But these were suddenly stones that were in a different league. I still enjoyed using very colourful stones, but things like this began to find a wider audience in America and elsewhere. Next one, please. So this was a, if you like, a collection that we've been doing for about 25 years now. Excuse me. And I think we probably made 100 different variations of the heart, and it is a very simple, very simple. Sorry, somebody with a microphone on.
Kelvin, I think. If you can turn your mic. Sorry, Theo.
So the piece in the middle, which we first made about 25 years ago, believe it or not, is the most popular. The devil heart outsells the angel heart by about 5 times, which gives you some idea of the nature of society nowadays. Okay, next one. So I started at art school as a portrait painter. So a lot of what I do is sort of portrait based, art based. This is a ring, an Oscar Wilde ring, which opens up and has a picture of the man that caused him so much trouble, Bosie, inside. It's an extraordinary piece of work. I mean, I can say that because the boys in the workshop made it rather than me. But even the box is a, if you like, Wildean box, and we've used Aubrey Beardsley's little details to make it. And it means that you can have this in your house when you're not wearing it as a sort of an object so people can look at it. But it's an extraordinarily complicated piece of work, and we do a lot of these portrait pieces. Okay, the next one. And the opening ring is something that I've worked with a lot, and I still love to do it. It's to make it well is very difficult. And this one has a pariba at the top. It's included so it looks like the sea, and it means you can just get a hint of the starfish when it's closed. When you open it up, there is a starfish, which is a great lucky symbol for many people, and deep engraved on the side are various fish. So it's something that we go from, and I go particularly from kind of motif to motif, from idea to idea, but all the time that I've been doing this, which is 40 odd years now, I've had a workshop, I've had a studio, and that's been the beating heart of the business, not the accounts office or the marketing, although obviously marketing is incredibly important, but I've always believed that jewelry should be designed by a designer and made by craftsmen rather than by a committee and then marketed all over the world as a sort of accessory. Next piece, please. This is I suppose this is total solipsism. I've made these as much to myself. I'm a huge Shakespeare fan. He's one of my great heroes, and these are 4 of my favorite characters from Shakespeare. And reading from left to right, Hamlet, Henry V, Portia, and Richard III. And I wanted to do this so that the candles threw the light like a spotlight, like an arc light, across the characters, and you can see how the shadows work. When the candles are flickering, it has a sort of, they have a life to themselves. And I think with figurative work, when it's so static in silver, you need to have both a really, really well carved statuette, but also to find ways of giving it some life. Next, please. And then taking the portrait thing forward, this is a brooch of Henry VIII taken from Holbein's great portrait. And I've always believed that a piece of jewelry made with many skills, which this one is, this involved 11 different people doing 11 different things, is kind of like building a small cathedral. Nobody is more important than the other. Everybody should be part of it. And with these, whether it's the mounter, whether it's the goldsmith, the engraver, the enameler, the box is covered with the badges of Henry VIII's badge at the top, and then the 6 badges of his wives going around the outside. And that's hand embroidered in gold lame by the lady who does the Queen's embroider on those big capes you see her in, and she's an incredible craftswoman. So all these things here, this is, as I say, 11 different people come together to make one piece in which nobody is more important than the other, and also fulfills my love of portrait. Is it the last one, or we're nearly there anyway? That is the last one. So that's kind of how we've gone from very small beginnings in a little corner shop, and now we have our own quite big shop, but it has the studio and the workshops in it above the gallery. And for me, that is the most important thing. The most important thing is that jewelry is made really beautifully and lasts not just a lifetime, but several lifetimes. I think the worst fate for a piece of jewelry is to end up in a shoebox under somebody's chest of drawers. There you are.
Okay, I'll throw it open for questions in a second, but I just wanted to ask you, you showed me once when I went to talk to you at the workshop, your one of your notebooks, which I think are quite famous. Everywhere you go, you're sketching for inspiration. So can inspiration essentially come from anywhere and everywhere? What sort of draws you?
These around with me everywhere. I've got one here, so I will do, that's the sort of house I was staying in at this time. But at one end I'll have things like that, little, I'll do little sketches like this, sort of wherever I am. And at one end, and then at the other end of the book, there will be, little ideas for earrings. These are the things I'm working on. So I'll have these, hundreds of them, and then sometimes I'll do a sort of illustrations. I'm just doing a turtle brooch. What I'm doing for the person is I'm doing a little, this will be an etching in the end of a turtle, and I'm just doing actually a little hedgehog for somebody, a little hedgehog ring, and that's going to be, I don't know if you can see it, but
yes, that'll
be, so part of what they'll get will be the box, and then a little etching like this with the finished artwork and the piece. I think it's all part of a process, which I think and hope that the person who's going to wear the piece and who's going to give the piece is part of the whole process. They become part of the whole process. And so, I spend my entire life, when I'm not sleeping, obviously, sketching or drawing. It's really, for me, it's the way to get what's going on in my mind done onto paper first, in whatever format that suits. So it can be a genuine drawing. It can be whether it's a portrait or a landscape or whatever. And from that will come the other ideas.
Yes. So it's not that you set out specifically like, I need to design some earrings now, I better sit down and think about it. It's more the other way around. You see something and that makes you think of an earring or a ring or a box or whatever it might be.
Yes. I mean, I think with sometimes there is an intent. I mean, say with the Shakespeare sticks, it's something I always wanted to make. It was then just working out what the pose would be and how the light would play on it and how they'd best be made. With bespoke work, sometimes one's given a pretty good idea of what the person wants, in that they've narrowed it down perhaps to a ring. They want it to be, let's say, a big ring. Roughly speaking, what they want to spend, what stones they want. So you've narrowed it down to a brief. And that's actually a lot easier because it's less kind of demanding. But if I'm just thinking of a piece of jewelry, sometimes I'll just think that would be a great idea, and then the next morning I think it's a terrible idea. But the as I've got older, I recognise one of the most important attributes you can have as a designer is the ability to edit. Excuse me. And when I was younger, I would just do thousands of drawings, and I would just think they all should be made into jewelry, and perhaps I was a bit excessive in that. But as I've got older and more experienced, not wiser, sadly, but more experienced, what has happened is I found the ability to edit down to things that I know can be made, that will be effective, that will actually do what I want them to do. Because between a drawing and even a technical drawing and the actual thing is a big journey. And only I think either luck or experience can, teach you which is going to be what's going to work. And the more things I've made and the more things we've worked on, the more you understand what works and what doesn't. So the editing process is now, I'll still sketch, but when I decide to sit down and think about a piece, and I think that goes for everyone in the studio as well, we're able to kind of edit it down to something we know is possible.
Are you managing to keep some people in the studio or a person in the studio while we're in lockdown? I mean, presumably, obviously, you can carry on designing wherever you are, but is there somebody, or are they working at home at their own benches? Is that kind of how it's working at the moment?
Yeah, we have these sort of meetings, and a lot of bespoke work is still going on. Obviously, the retail side is frankly challenging.
Yes.
But we're various things on the internet. We're doing some auctions for a local charity.
You did an auction recently for, or has that not happened yet, to raise money?
Yeah, did one for the Kensington Chelsea Foundation, which looks after people who need looking after in and around where we are, and there are a lot of them, either older people or people who are unable to get out themselves or whatever. And we did that, and that raised some money for them. We're doing another one which has just started to raise money as well. So there's that going on.
Yes.
It makes it possible for these things. But no, I have a meeting with the studio, as it were, whenever we need one. And we've got boys working at workshops at home. We've got two that already had workshops at home, but a couple have gone home and built little workshops. They took stuff. One, in fact, took the laser machine, which is now taking up the whole of his kitchen. I'm not sure his wife is, but and so we talk about that. I've worked with them for a long time, so we can kind of communicate in shorthand, and I can do what I did then and just hold up a drawing or whatever. So and we can send it by computer. So no, we're managing to get on with things. Obviously, there are things like bullion dealers and polishers and people that we have need of who are in lockdown. So it's complicated, very complicated.
Yeah. Back to normal everyday life. Obviously, coloured stones have always been incredibly important to you, as you were saying from the very beginning. Do you have a sort of all-time favourite stone, or does it keep shifting as you discover new stones?
Yes, I'm very fickle. I'm incredibly fickle, and
I asked a question back in 2017 for something. I think the Gems and Jewellery magazine, and then it was opal. You said that, so that's years ago. Have you gone off that now?
No, I haven't gone off it, but I'm not so passionate about it. I'm afraid to say that I am. Yes, I'm not a constant lover when it comes to stones. I mean, interestingly, I years and years ago, I bought a Paraiba for an American. Well, in fact, I persuaded her to have a Paraiba 20 odd years ago, which was 20 carat and absolutely flawless. And I charged her £50,000 for it, which was a huge amount of money for a stone that nobody knew anything about. I made a really beautiful ring for her because it was my passion then. And it was a genuine Paraiba from the mine and whatever. And she is a very rich woman. And she rang me the other day to say that she'd taken it to have it valued for insurance. And they valued it at $2 million. I wanted to weep. Of course, I was happy for her. But I wish I'd kept it. But again, it's like everything, if I could afford to keep all the stones I wanted to, all the pictures or whatever, then you've got to be rich enough to be able to keep those things, and we never have been. But I think we move on. I think by the time Paraiba became such a popular stone, we sort of moved on. And I'm very much taken now by the moment by some odd little things like Naima red spinels, that very bright sort of raspberry orangey red. And I think it's like anything, you sort of, and then you go back to things, you know, you suddenly go, that's such a nice stone. And I was looking at some very kind of forest green tourmalines the other day because I'm doing a brooch which is sort of, if you like, a forest, but a sort of, you know, abstract forest, and using these very subtle different colours of green tourmaline with just a few diamonds in there. I realised just what a spectrum just of green tourmaline has. Yeah.
Mm.
So yeah.
So it could be simply the colour that draws you to your eye to a stone, and not specifically the stone itself, its own intrinsic. So
oh, no. When I see, I have a few stone dealers with whom I've dealt with for years and years, and one specific one who is, when I first knew him, he's Ukrainian, and he was unable. He's a beautiful, wonderful cutter. I mean, just he's fantastic, and has a girl working for him who's also, she's a fantastic cutter, but they could only cut things they could get in Ukraine in those days, you know, which was bizarrely things that we couldn't get, like lapis from Afghanistan and wherever the Russians were. And it was, we seem to have gone. And
I think it'll come back in a second.
Okay. It was a sort of odd thing that when the Russian sort of Federation suddenly opened up and he was able to get new things, he would go all around the world looking for really, really unusual pieces. And I've used him forever because he knows exactly what I like. And so with him, it's not just the type of stone, it's a very specific, unusual color that he's fantastic at. And also, he cuts it beautifully. So he'll do the best for a stone. So I tend to fall in love with a stone in his case.
Just a reminder to everybody joining in the meeting, if you want to ask a question for Theo, please type it into the chat, and it will come up, and then I'll stop asking. What was I also going to say? You how involved the online side of your business is obviously incredibly important at the moment, particularly. But is that something that you get involved in, or are you leaving that to your marketing people? I mean, do you enjoy that sort of technical interaction, as it were, the social media side and whatever?
Well, on the technical side, I know nothing. I mean, I don't know how it works in any way at all. So I don't have anything to do with the technical side. I have a lot to do with you know, we're redoing it at the moment, and because really, I think if you were to come into our store and look at the pieces and have a look around the workshop and the studios, I think anybody who does that really understands the business, and they understand how it works, and that it is a very kind of all and inclusive thing. And my dream is to get a website that reproduces that experience. It needs to be practical, so you can buy things. But so I'm very involved in what we're doing now, which is try and get people to come in, see how things are made, look at the workshop, whatever, but on the internet.
Yeah. Question from John: when you buy stones, do you normally have a design in mind for it, or does the stone bring you the inspiration for the design?
It's about 50-50. I quite often we have stones cut to fit a specific design, because we are, I don't know, let's say we were making a scarab, we'd have a stone cut, you know, to the shape that's been designed. But if I fall in love with a stone, then it's normally because I've seen in my mind, I've seen what's going to happen to that stone. It doesn't always happen by a long chalk. And we was discussed where that expression comes from. But anyway, you know, so I about 50-50 have them made or buy them.
So I'm just looking at. This is a question from Sam Gillett. I personally love your Wizard of Oz and Wind in the Willows rings. Are these ideas which you had for a long time due to a passion for the books or films? And how did you develop the ideas?
The answer is yes. I mean, they were made not bespoke. They were made, you know, on spec. I just made them because I love the books. But also, but for the Wind and the Willows, I was trying to work out. We'd just done a castle ring, which had a drawbridge that comes down and goes back. It literally does go back, not just clicks, but has the, you know, what would be the chains going back. Yeah. Very complicated. And on the Wind and the Willows, we'd done one that had poo sticks. It had Pooh and Winnie the Pooh and Eeyore on top of the bridge, and we got the shank to spin round under the bridge so that they could watch the sticks coming under the bridge. And so I was looking for something else that we could also put a river underneath and have little gates that opened up and things. And I just thought that Mole and Toad would be terrific. On the Emerald City ring, that was really, you know, the idea of getting the yellow brick road going into the ring and then the Emerald City inside and things was just too good an opportunity to miss. So we made that. It's now in Brazil, from whence the emeralds came. So bizarrely.
Was that a commission, or did they buy it?
No, both those two. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we yeah, it's quite a few things we make on. I mean, there's one here which I've got. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a little opening ring, and on the top is this is a blue tourmaline that's been hollowed out, and we put the stars, diamonds are put inside it in the configuration you'd have in the summer solstice. And inside here is I don't know if you can see it, but it's a very, very small Stonehenge. So that closes like that, and then it has the day on one side with the sun and the moon on the other. So that's, you know, made because I just happen to like Stonehenge. See how it goes.
Okay, Rosanna asks, what advice would you give to young designers trying to carve their own path in the industry?
Well, I mean, I have this thing called Gilded Youth, where we try to do just that for young designers and young craftspeople, and we work a lot with the Royal College and with Central St Martin's, but also with some secondary schools and Goldsmiths Centre and that sort of thing to talk to kids and whatever. And we have a young girl apprentice at the moment who's brilliant. So I try and get as involved as I can with young hopefuls, because I know that when I started, the biggest problems I had were I understood nothing about business. I understood nothing about the process of getting out there and showing people things. And I knew nothing really about the sort of nitty-gritty technicality. So the first thing that I realized was really important was to learn how it is done, how it's made, whatever it is you're designing, whether it's going to be a one-off or whether it's going to be 5,000, you know, bits of fashion jewelry. You must understand the processes, you must understand the techniques, and you must understand the materials. The second is to learn as much as you can about the process of business, because of how your business can work and how to charge people and how to manage cash flow. It sounds incredibly boring, and it is, but if you don't do it, you, like me, you'll come unstuck again and again. I sort of trusted people. I didn't know how much to charge. I didn't, you know, ask for 50% up front when I should have done all those sort of things. And I made a bundle of very simple mistakes, which if I'd worked for somebody for 2 or 3 years, and I'd even done an online course, which you can do now, because in those days you couldn't, I could have avoided so many things. But I think beyond the practicalities and beyond the technical knowledge you need, I think the first thing is to have an absolute passion for jewelry, so that you are going to jewelry shows, you're going around museums, you're looking at everything, you're breathing in every kind of bit of jewelry for 5,000 years of jewelry. So it really becomes the thing you want to do, in the same ways that if you were a pianist, you'd be practicing every day. If you were an actor, you'd be knocking on doors trying to get a part. And you need to be passionate. And if you're passionate enough, and you know enough, and you're good enough, you will find a voice. And when you find that voice, people will hear it. But when you get those opportunities, you really, really need to be able to take them. And I would say to people that you can be the most talented person in the world, but I think you need to have 30% common sense, 50% tenacity, 10% luck, and 10% talent. And I know that sounds like a sort of flying in the face of everything we hold dear, but really, talent, sadly, is not enough to get noticed. You've got to be able to know what you're doing, and you've got to be able to work at it, and you've got to work very, very hard. You know, nobody got anywhere really without the hard work, but that's what I would say.
Okay. Yeah, in fact, that was sort of going to be one of my questions, because I obviously knew about Gilded Youth, and it said that one of the things you wanted to do was to warn them against the many mistakes that you have made, but you sort of you've alluded to it there, and it's essentially the sort of business side of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when you look at sort of songwriters from the 60s or 70s, and you look at people who had a band, you think, oh my God, you know, people always think they must be so rich, whatever. And they signed things that gave them a penny in the pound for their songs, whatever, famously. And everyone thinks, God, they must have been idiots. But nobody knew. Nobody knew in those days what it meant. And when I became a jewelry designer, it wasn't like now. I mean, I meet 5 jewelry designers a day. You know, I mean, I get calls, I get people going to see me. I mean, it's become a thing that so many people want to be. And I have a feeling it's because people think it's a sort of shortcut thing. You get a few beads and string them together on a beach in Ibiza, and you're a jewelry designer. But to put jewelry designer on your passport as a profession, you have to be making money out of it. And I straight away, when I was, you know, starting to get noticed and things were starting to go well, I had to get somebody in to invest. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to borrow from a bank or anything like that. And I sold my name for nothing, for peanuts. And it became an absolute it became one of the absolute thorns in my side, because wherever I went, I had to work with people who could buy my name, and it was only recently that I've been able to get it back, because I didn't know. How did I know? I just believed some bright person who was a businessman, as it were, and you know, you know, on the whole, creatives are not the best business people, but it's not, I don't believe, an excuse. I don't believe that I can blame anyone else for my own foolhardiness. I was foolish. I didn't take the trouble to find out about these things. I'm still very sad that it happened, and maybe even a little bitter. But anyway, the point is, it did. And one of the things I want to say to young people is, hang on to your name. Don't. It's so seductive when someone comes along and says, I'll buy 51% of your business for £500,000. You go, oh my God, I can make all these things I wanted to make. 2 years later, you realise you've given it away. Never sell your name.
Yeah, I remember it happening to Margaret Howell, the fashion designer, and thinking just how awful that your own name is not, you know.
But you know, what do you know? I see these kids who are, you know, some of them bursting with talent, bursting with ambition, but they don't really understand the business thing, and they haven't really, you know, they really need somebody to say, don't do it. And I've got no best interest, because I'm not going to, you know, buy their businesses or whatever. So I just felt that somebody who'd experienced it, and somebody who had no vested interest in sort of trying to, you know, gain from it, would be a good person to tell them to not do it.
Are you going? Are you going to continue the Gilded Youth initiative once we're all back at work and everything is back to normal? Is that a continuous thing for you?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah, completely. And it's funny enough, it is sort of going on while we're in lockdown, because I do these sort of design awards and design sort of initiatives with some of the art schools, and when the winners get to sort of have the piece made and come into the workshop and see how it's done, and then see how we market it, and we give them a sort of show, get in the press and things, whatever. So they can still be doing that. I think it's just the unfortunate at the moment we can't make the pieces and whatever. So yeah, no, they can't have their degree show. So you know, it's been stunted somewhat, but no, we can certainly help. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Any more questions from anybody? Please fire them over. Or have I managed to cover everything? There must be loads and loads and loads. I remember once watching you do a presentation at, I think it was either IJL or it must have been IJL, I think. There was a sort of panel discussion thing. And I was laughing and crying so much listening to you that when I looked at my notes afterwards, they didn't really make any sense at all.
Yeah.
Everybody was just so busy with this your outrageous anecdotes. So it's
yes, I'm not sure. You know, it has to be a sort of a fettered place. I think we know that the internet is probably too unfettered to say some of them. But I think one of the things that I feel that jewelry can very often lack is a sense of humor. And I don't mean it's a joke. I don't mean it has to be a sort of joke, but it can have something that is, you know, amusing and fun. This is a thing I made some years ago. I made 3 of them. And this is Damien Hirst's head as a ring, wearing his dark glasses. And then I opened it up, and inside is the diamond skull. And I'm not saying it's something you roar with laughter at, but it has a certain level of humor to it.
Yeah.
But it's also beautifully made by the boys. And I think that people tend to take something that should be life enhancing and joyous, and it can have, you know, it can be very sentimental. It can be something that perhaps commemorates a very sad event. But by and large, jewelry is there to make us feel good. And if you think that for thousands of years people have been getting old walnuts or, you know, bits of wire and making something to adorn themselves with, even in times like this, if I was in lockdown here and couldn't get any materials, I'd start working with some of the pebbles outside or whatever, because I think there's something you can just do with anything. Now, I don't believe in power jewelry, and I'm not a fan of fashion jewelry. I don't make it. It's not what I don't have anything against it, but I do think jewelry that I like to get involved in should have some sort of emotional heft to it and some humor. So I like the idea of people being cheered up by jewelry, by it being joyous. And, you know, the people I work with are unbelievable characters. I mean, for 40 years, I've worked with some of the most extraordinary and outrageous people you could ever meet. I mean, you know, I used to deal with a caster, brilliant caster, sadly no longer with us, who is the single rudest man I have ever met in my life. And he would literally treat everybody, clients, people work with him, people in the street, the same way. How he was never killed or beaten up, I have no idea, but he was unbelievably rude. And it became, I used to go there just if I was passing, just to be sworn at by him, because his swearing was so unbelievably creative. I mean, he used to come up with things you simply couldn't believe. You know, I thought, you know, I should have written them down, but he was the most fantastic caster. He was brilliant. There were 2 men that sat opposite each other for 50 years, probably. One who made wooden plinths for trophies, and one who made the little corks that went in the top of flasks. Both craftsmen that would not be needed now and, you know, gone. But both of them sat in this sort of miasma of either wood chipping or pork chipping with cigarettes in them. Every time they lit one, there'd be a sort of halo around them. And they would argue with each other across the corridor. One was in here, one was there. The door were open. But they would sort of wait till someone came like me and said, can you tell him he's a complete whatever? And I said, no, you can tell him. I'm not talking to him. And I would have to be the intermediary in this argument. And they were like that for 50 years. They were brilliant craftsmen, wonderful people. So sad now that with the, you know, the growth of the huge brands and things, that everything's all made in factory, whatever. Those crafts and those craftsmen, one of my absolute passions is to make sure those men and women who have that talent have somewhere to use it and to continue the thing, because they're brilliant things. They're wonderful things. They give so much joy and great characters, you know.
Okay, another couple of questions. From Sam. Do you pull any particular inspiration from a previous design style, such as Art Deco or Art Nouveau, or do you take pieces of inspiration from each?
I don't think you can help taking some sort of inspiration from all sorts of things. And sometimes it's utterly obvious. I mean, the Holbein brooch there is essentially a reproduction of a Holbein picture, but in carved bone and enamel and diamonds and whatever. But sometimes it's a bit more insidious. I think you find yourself doing something, you think, oh, hang on, that's a bit Art Deco or that's a bit Art Nouveau. I'm not a big Deco fan, although I was, but I never really did any Deco jewelry or had that as a particularly big influence. But certainly Art Nouveau, certainly Byzantine jewelry and Saxon jewelry. And I think if it's an interesting thing, if you look at somebody looking in a window in Bond Street at the enormous sort of diamonds, enormous emeralds there, it's kind of like watching somebody watching a firework display. Their first comment afterwards, after the whole thing ends, is normal. The first thing that goes through their brain, my God, what did that cost? Rather than that was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. It's a sort of explosion of power and money. And at the far end, people are looking at, you know, sort of brand costume, well, fashion jewelry, if you like, in the same way they would as a handbag or a belt or a pair of shoes. But in the middle, and the stuff that I really love, go to the British Museum or the V&A or anywhere, one of the great museums, and watch people looking at jewelry there. They're so much more engaged. They're thinking about who made it, about the history of it, about who was involved, who gave it to whom. They're thinking about what it would have been like in a Saxon village. They're thinking about what it would have been like in a Byzantine basement or whatever. And it's so much more full of story, and not just the history and the age of it, but the sort of intent of it. And I think what you can really tell with a piece of jewelry is how much passion, how much intent there is in there. And so certainly all those ages of jewelry have influenced me all the time.
Okay, Rosanna asked, do you think people will begin buying more valuable pieces of jewelry online now, in brackets after COVID, or do you think they will still want the personal experience of visiting a boutique and meeting designers, etc.?
I think the sort of move away from the big brands that's been happening for the last 3 or 4 years into much more personal things, one-off things, and having one really good piece made that lasts a lifetime rather than lots of gewgaws that you swap and change is going to continue. And I think people will want to come into, I think in a store like ours, it's very different because you can see the workshop, you can see the studio, you know, it's an all-encompassing thing. But I do believe, and that's why I'd love to be able to reproduce the experience online, I do think people are getting more confident in buying online, and I think they start to know what things are actually like. And I think if they can share the experience, then yes, they can. But I think it's very, what is important is that shops that don't offer an experience and businesses that don't have this whole kind of all-encompassing feel to them are going to be all but redundant. I mean, unless they're selling something you need, every day.
Okay, great, thank you. Unless there's any more questions, I think our hour session is just about up. So if you've got a question, a couple of minutes left, but otherwise, I think we can say thank you, Theo, so much for your time. That's brilliant, as I would be.
Lovely speaking to you.
Okay, and thanks everybody for joining us. Okay, take care, everybody.
God bless. Bye.
Okay, yeah.